Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, March the 19th. Keir Starmer is caught between Angela Rayner on one side and Shabana Mahmood on the other over immigration. Which way he turns will indicate the future direction of his premiership. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Yesterday lunchtime, Downing Street suggested the shape of the government's crackdown on immigration would be determined by a consultation, maybe suggesting that a climb down was in the air. And that came after Angela Rayner blasted plans by the Home Secretary to double to 10 years the time taken for most migrants who arrived in the so-called Boris wave of 2021 to 2024 to get permanent residency.
But then, 3 hours later, Downing Street and the Home Office signed off a joint statement saying the position had not changed, that the impact of the Boris wave needed to be managed, and this involved the question of whether hundreds of thousands of migrants would get settlement and when. This looked to me very much like the Home Office had wrestled back the position for now. But Anne, the question, as so often with Keir Starmer, is, will it stick?
At this rate, who knows? The government will sift through 200,000 or so responses to the consultation. Really, the question is how much weight they put on the views of Rayner and the likes of Andy Burnham, the Metro Manchester mayor, who chipped in yesterday in support of her. And here's the key. Back in November, Shabana Mahmood herself said there would be transitional arrangements for those already in the country before that decade-long wait would be applied. And the question is how extensive those transitional arrangements would be. We should find out in the coming months, but it looks like something that can't be dragged out too long if it's just becoming such a drama point.
Or because the decision has to be made by the autumn when the next window for changing the rules is. Just a little thought about the politics of this. It suits everybody, including me at the intro, to present this as a choice by Keir Starmer between Angela Rayner and Shabana Mahmood. But it really isn't that. It's a lot more awkward for Keir Starmer than that, because these are plans by the Home Secretary that Keir Starmer absolutely signed off on. He wrote the forward to the consultation. He signed off on the table of who exactly would and wouldn't be subject to longer periods before settlement is granted. The table is in the consultation. He said yes. So actually, it's a question about whether Keir Starmer is going back on his own word, going back on his own position agreed with another Whitehall department. Now, I remember when all of this was published in November, hearing that some inside the Home Office felt like they got it through because it was then Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney that gave it a shove. And so you ask the question, with Morgan McSweeney not there, could the politics slip back in favour of the soft left again? But it really does matter if the Prime Minister can stick to things that he has agreed with, if he can give a sense that he's not only the product of his advisors and that the word of Keir Starmer is his bond. Because I'm just not quite sure, Anne, that cabinet government functions if it just depends on who the advisor is at any given moment.
Although that has been the way that it's functioned, or quite often malfunctioned, isn't it? And now we've just got that gap. I just feel there are so many gaps around the Prime Minister. And the biggest one is, what position does he want to be associated with? And I absolutely take your point. This has been carefully put together, and you pointed this out very well on the podcast yesterday, so that there are not big legislative moments around which opposition can group, but this has to be dealt with, by the autumn. It's clearly become a talking point now, and it's being pushed. Of all the areas Angela Rayner could have started her big sort of comeback plan, she chose this one. And in the end, you're left uncertain, what does Keir Starmer think? And to me, that seems the bigger gap. It's maybe not the sort of technical gap, but it is the one that I think a lot of MPs and a lot of people in the public just look for a bit clearer of a line on. Does he really want to go tough on this because he thinks this is the signal that he wants to send for his government? Or is it going to all go into this long world of consultations, exceptions, and arguments about the fine detail of implementation? Because we don't have the word from the man at the top, it gets harder to follow.
And this is true of so many different things. Like in the autumn, when this issue comes to the crunch, another one will come to the crunch, which is the send reforms. Parts of the government send plan have been outlined, but not the difficult bits. The difficult bits have to emerge in the legislation. So I think that applies equally, and to so many other things like welfare reform. And I think Angela Rayner will have views on several of them. But Anne, you've got news of another thing that she is already training her sights on.
Indeed, Radio Rayner seems to be broadcasting on a number of frequencies at the moment. I think you were saying yesterday, Sam, that her initial aim was to rejoin government after the May elections, and that the interventions are really about trying to set some terms for that and prod the government, aka Keir Starmer, in her direction, to set herself, I suppose, some sort of target for why she would agree to come back. Now, not everybody is certain that this intervention has helped that cause. Someone, a senior minister, indeed, telling my colleague Dan Bloom, I wouldn't be surprised if Angela's intervention has made things worse. Shabana will look at this and think, I don't want to be bounced into it, and pointing out that the proposals, as we just discussed, had already been shaped in a certain way, and there was potential for them to shift to a certain extent even before the Rayner speech. Well, it was going to happen anyway, is one of those lines in politics. I'll just leave it there. Some signs in the Times story that the target for Rayner is moving from Shabana Mahmood to ... Rachel Reeves, because they report that days after Rayner promised to respect the fiscal rules in the manifesto, she was privately criticising the OBR on that call with bankers that she made recently. And she attacked the scoring method used by the OBR to calculate the impact to growth on government policies and to calculate the amount of that fiscal headroom sitting too tightly on the Chancellor's head. It must be said, Sam, she's not alone in that point, that the scoring of the Office for Budget Responsibility is too onerous. It limits policy choices too tightly. But it's also an argument, I think, increasingly used by people who want to loosen that fiscal girdle and spend and borrow more. And that's not really a conversation that Rachel Reeves wants to have in public at the moment.
God, no. I think if Shabana Mahmood feels pretty battered today, Rachel Reeves might soon be the next one in that camp. And this is a good story, I thought, from Aubrey Allegretti. I'd actually picked up a whiff of this from City Contact some weeks ago, been praising for it. And as you say, Angela Rayner's not the only one. This is manna from heaven from some on the left of the Labour Party. You can remember Lou Haig making similar arguments, the ex-Transport Secretary a few months back, on the floors of the OBR. And ironically, Angela Rayner will get enthusiastic backing, I'd imagine, from one Liz Truss on the right of politics, who's mounting similar arguments as well. But, exactly as you just said, my City contacts say to me that they see right through this. They think that the fiscal watchdog does a pretty good job preventing the government engaging in fantasy economics and attaching absurdly optimistic projections to plans that they want to enact. And that's why it exists. That's why George Osborne invented it. He always thought it would make life more tricky for the left than the right. So they say, by City Contacts, that it's something that goes in the negative column when assessing whether or not to believe Angela Rayner's protestations of fiscal rectitude.
Interesting. I'm always struck by the fact that the OBR was held up when Labour was coming into office and in the latter stages of the election campaign as a holy grail and an item of veneration. And it was only the Liz Trussites who would dare to go against it, only to find that they too have problems with that corset squeezing the innards when they want to spend more. Striking, there's domestic instability when the global picture is so bleak. And in a further blow on that, Iranian missiles hit a Qatari complex, an important one at Ras Laffan industrial city that hosts the world's largest LNG, liquid natural gas export plant. Extensive damage there and a sharp escalation of attacks on energy facilities all across the Gulf. The upshot is that crude and natural gas prices are surging, and the US is warning of retaliation. So this does not look like we're going into the de-escalation phase much called for.
Absolutely not. It's not really the business of this podcast, but my goodness, Donald Trump's Truth Social posts overnight. I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast will get a chance to look at it. They are absolutely wild, putting distance between what Israel did with the Qatari facilities, more threats and all the rest of it. But back to domestic things, all of this is going to feed through to the domestic economy. And look, at the start of the week, we were talking about the threat of shortages, disruption, inflation, and I still think that's underpriced politically. It was nowhere in yesterday's Prime Minister's questions. It strikes me that this is close to the biggest issue that we've got, if there's going to have to be, maybe, as a former advisor to Gordon Brown said, rationing within a matter of months. It's feeding through in other areas, however. Behind the scenes, it's having an impact. Today, we actually get details of how the aid budget will be spent in the coming years. But the link to what we were just talking about is that I'm told that over the weekend, the Treasury briefly withdrew or sort of signalled that they might pause approval to the plan that you're going to hear about later today, because they were doing contingency planning precisely about whether or not the government's going to have to spend taxpayers' money elsewhere because of what's going on with Iran and the oil price. But then Labour MPs heard about it. I mean, there were rumours circulating, and all of us picked up on, got whiff of it, lobbied Number 10 over the weekend, who intervened, and this plan got shut down. And Downing Street now deny that there are going to be cuts to the aid budget above and beyond what we already saw. So clearly the Treasury is on the hunt for cash. But the aid budget itself has already been so squeezed. I think it's pretty bleak what we're going to hear today if you think that aid spending is important.
Well, yes, and remember that Keir Starmer promising just over a year ago that he would slash aid funding to increase defence spending, describing it then as a decision he didn't want to make. There's that great sense of reluctance around this in Labour. And it's the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who gets to lay out the thinking behind delivering on that, as you say, having, I think, this plan for an extra squeeze having been seen off. But this is still pretty strong stuff, the extent to which it goes in the other direction from the Labour manifesto pledge to restore development spending to 0.7% of GDP as soon as fiscal circumstances allow. Well, that phrase from the manifesto does ring rather hollow when the impact now is reducing aid spending to just 0.3%. Playbook reporting that Cooper will announce that a chunk of aid spending that remains will be prioritised into aid for Gaza, for Ukraine and Sudan. That's a subject, particularly the last one, I think, where Yvette Cooper has been, and rather creditably as it is, something a dreadful and forgotten conflict to an extent. These are going to be the countries assessed as having the greatest humanitarian need. But on this kind of money and these very, very skinny funding that there is going to be, the slashing of the aid budget cuts out a lot of aid to Afghanistan, to Syria, which is, intriguing in the context of the present crisis and what could go further wrong in the Middle East, to Somalia and to Ethiopia.
Yeah, once upon a time, Britain's international aid project was about much more than just emergency relief, but it feels like it's been scaled back to pretty much that. So not only countries, but also purposes like education. I think it's one of the things that we spend money on overseas that's been hugely squeezed. There's another sort of foreign policy issue this morning that I think is quite pressing. And overnight, we've imposed 50% import tariffs on all steel goods. This is part of Peter Carl's steel strategy, and he's hoping it protects the industry in a very turbulent environment. But this is really striking. This is an unusual move for Britain. We don't normally have a habit of using tariffs protectively. In fact, so much of the Chancellor, the Prime Minister talk about free trade, open trade, and push for trade deals that lower trade barriers. But suddenly we're going in the opposite direction. So this is a really big moment. Even steel from the EU will be subject to 50% tariffs. Now, of course, that matches the surprise, awkward 50% tariff that the EU have imposed on our steel going in the other direction. So it's tit for tat. But just the fact that our trade policy is evolving into something to do with additional barriers, I know we're playing catch up with the rest of the world, but as my colleague Ed Conway says, This is the biggest increase in trade barriers imposed by British government in at least a generation. It's quite something.
And Ed is quite right about that. And when you think that this was supposed to be an environment, even if we look back to those negotiations with Donald Trump, and we talked about on the podcast a lot last year, that the UK would be seeking tariff reductions and hope that steel would be, that was going to be the big bumper sticker one to pursue. Well, that's all gone very quiet anyway. And it's now going completely the other way, proof that globalization as we once knew it is dead. And that is a quote directly from the May speech of the Chancellor. It does pull against the desire to align more with Europe, doesn't it? If our relationship comes down to kind of tit for tat, large tariffs. In this case, Peter Kyle, I think the headline idea is to protect what remains of the British steel industry, and that's what he wants to achieve in the short term. I'm told by my colleagues covering this on the European side, Sam, that the EU and UK are expected to seek carve-outs as we go along, getting very dedicated and focused, lowering tariffs each step by step so that it shouldn't stay at 50% on each side, and then unite in the fight against cheaper Chinese steel. The trouble was they couldn't get to that agreement in a timely way. And I think Peter Kyle particularly wanted to move on this for domestic reasons. Lots of warnings, I think, from European steelmakers saying if this is implemented too harshly, and particularly on downstream products, because it's often a bit about how far the tariff applies and what's in it and what's out of it, then that could actually set off another tit-for-tat tariff spiral with Europe. So watch this one.
Peter Kyle wanted to get a carve-out on steel from the EU back in October, the moment that it was imposed. And all we've done since then, I'm sure there's been arguments behind this, but all we've done since then is raise our own tariffs, right? I'm not sure that debate is going in the right direction. We're desperate to get rid of those EU tariffs because of what they symbolise, as well as because of what they do to a very sensitive bit of the industry. It's Thursday. I've got a couple of bits of political fun for you, Anne, as we head to the end of the political week.
Oh, I could do with that. I really could do with that.
So we're actually doing a whole special programme today on the criminal justice system. The reason is we've got sort of really unusual polling from YouGov. They've managed to poll the police and they've managed to poll victims, and you don't often get that, and there's all sorts of really interesting nuggets in that, including extraordinary 51% of people working in the police say that they've experienced or seen bullying at work and all of that kind of stuff. But here's the fun bit. For our special programme, presenter Sarah Jane Mee interviewed Policing Minister Sarah Jones, who revealed that she, the policing minister, had seen how her kids had their phones stolen, and basically confessed that the police basically weren't able to help despite her job. Listen to this exchange.
Our absolute focus is on that epidemic of everyday crime and tackling those issues. It is not acceptable that people will get their phone stolen and there isn't a response that they would expect. I've suffered from that. My kids, when they had their phones stolen, these things are enormously traumatic and very real.
Yeah, tell me about that. What was that like as a family, as a victim of crime? What was that process like? Because what we're hearing is it's miserable.
Well, of course, it's a miserable experience. Everybody knows that when you have something stolen from you, it's very scary.
Yeah, but what happens afterwards is even worse for some people.
The response from the police was great. What I think we're not good at is
did they get the phones back?
In touch. So I don't know what the outcome was. They didn't get the phones back. I don't know if anybody ended up being convicted. And it's that communication process that I think we need to work on in the police. And to be fair to them, they are super busy because of all the bureaucracy they're dealing with, because of the demand.
So yes, the policing minister saying the police are great, but it didn't seem like they really helped in that occasion.
Yes. Well, I suppose I think about what I think about that. I think the policing minister being open about the fact that this is something that worries parents a lot, also about having their kids having their phones or anybody having their phones stolen, but also that she's so quite candid about it, and that it's something where the police don't feel at the moment able to intervene enough. That's fascinating. I'll take a look at that.
One more little bit of fun. This is something that would worry MPs if it ever happened, but there are huge behind-the-scenes efforts to stop it. You will remember that we are awaiting a report by the Parliamentary Commissioner of Standards into Andrew Gwynn, who quit, and then Labour lost the seat in South Manchester. But something in the drafts of that report is ringing massive alarm bells. Part of Daniel Greenberg's report, well, bits of it are into the behaviour of Andrew Gwynn, but bits of it are about things that might have to change. And he has suggested that any WhatsApp group that an MP is in should be subject to the Parliamentary Code of Conduct. Let me translate what that means. Any leak of a WhatsApp group where somebody is accused of bullying or unparliamentary conduct should then be disclosed to Daniel Greenberg. In other words, the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards wanting to be able to see much wider free range to go into any group that an MP, any WhatsApp group that an MP is on. These has horrified people that got early wind of what happened. The idea that Greenberg could be poking through people's private exchanges in case there is something unparliamentary about it seems to rail against everything they think is fair. I have to say, it strikes me as a fairly bizarre proposal, and there are attempts to get this out of that report. But of course, because of the changes that were made to the system, you're only meant to be able to approve or reject the report in full to do with Andrew Gwynn. So it's a bit of a sticky issue. Let's see how that one plays out.
I'm trying to imagine the use of disappearing messages function would rise quite considerably in that case. It does sound massively interventionist, doesn't it? But I sort of doubt that would be what comes out of the pipe. But as you say, it's trying to get around that awkward corner in the report.
Right. It is pretty much the end of the week. We've got some sad news. A friend of this podcast star, TV star, Bob the Cat has passed away. So we will no longer be having him brushing past the camera, all of those videos. But we, however, will remain doing what we do in his memory. So with that in mind, Anne, what are you up to this weekend over the next few days?
Yes, I just want to say I too will very much miss Bob walking across your laptop keyboard. He's a lovely cat, and he consumed an awful lot of politics in his life. I am going to race out of the door now, the Eurostar. I'm off to Brussels to interview the UN Secretary General, I should say, Antonio Guterres, on the war in Iran and the role of the UN and where that sits. And that should hopefully drop as an interview over the next day or so.
I look forward to hearing that, and maybe we'll talk about it on Monday. Thank you very much indeed. We will see you next week.
See you next week.